This is not a subject that actually I know much about, and I want to apologize ahead of time for some concerns that I have as an outsider regarding how we might actually advance what seem to be self-evidently virtuous goals. We have a tendency to talk to ourselves, and there's a kind of feeling of comfort in kindred souls, and overlook the paradoxes that face this kind of effort, which is extremely and indisputably noble. Why is it that interdependence, however you term it, doesn't flourish in the face of so much evidence that it is the logical and the beneficial and the most utilitarian way about going about our business as human beings? First of all, there's the economic reality, which is more prevalent now than in any previous generation, that what is called interdependence is a self-evident proposition. There is very little left that is dynamic economically, that's particularly local, whether it's what we eat or what we consume. The overused words, globalization, the actual character of finance and industry is such that to talk about a non-interdependent world seems nonsensical. Then there's the obvious cliche. The second biggest cliche after the economic one is the technological one, where we're told, we know this already, that communication, Ben suggested we have a campus in Kyrgyzstan, and I can actually have a meeting with my colleagues in Kyrgyzstan on Skype, and in real time. It's a little later for them, a little earlier for us, but it, as well as, of course, the internet, email, and everything else we've heard about ad nauseum, Twitter, and the like. So we're interdependent, but it seems to make no difference whatsoever. Technology, to me, as a historical factor, is relatively neutral. I'm not sure that the telephone has changed our sexual lives, however useful it might be to some. The same can be said about transportation. The fact that we move faster, quicker, is very important, but how transformative it is of human behavior, I'm not quite sure. Nonetheless, if we ever lived in a time when technology would recommend what we call interdependence, it's absolutely the case. Third paradox, of course, science, which has exploded one of the bases of the concept of interdependence, the idea that there's something separate that has to be related. You know, modern science has revealed that we are more alike than different biologically, and that all of human differentiation derives from Africa, that definitionally the differences we make so much of are invented, that the concept of race is not a scientific concept any more than the concept of nation is. So the fact is that these three very powerful motivations for interdependence seem particularly powerless in the sense that we would like them to be. The political structures don't mirror those realities in the economic sense, in the technological sense, or even in the scientific sense. Now, interdependence is really a contingent idea that is really derived from the way we define ourselves. One of the things that's very terrifying about this is not the first time some form of movement for interdependence has tried to take hold. Everything from the Esperanto movement to try to create a single language, to various forms of internationalism in the 20th century, after the First World War, after the Second World War, and they all seem to have failed miserably. And so why should we succeed? What gives us any cause for optimism? And one way is to look at the sources of failure that plagued previous iterations of this. The first is, of course, is that the way we define ourselves needs to be examined. we assume we heard an Irish, two Irish musicians who sing a song that can be sung in Gaelic or in English or in a Native American language. Those of us who study the history of music will tell you that if you want to learn about folk music, something that Béla Bartók discovered in his own researches in the 30s, is that the pentatonic, for example, scale, and many of the rhythmic patterns that we identify with folk music aren't particularly unique. They may all derive from North Africa. In some way, all of it sounds the same. People who are devoted to klezmer musicians and klezmer music will discover that it's really indistinguishable from Ukrainian folk music. And this conceit of specificity is a dangerous one. Béla Bartók himself, one of the great ethnomusicologists, as well as a composer, ran afoul of the fascist government in the 1930s in Hungary because his work on Slovakian, Romanian, and Hungarian folk music really obliterated the differences between them, which went against the nationalist and reductive Hungarian nationalism of the regime of the 1930s, a reductive nationalism that has now had a recent revival in current Hungarian politics. So the question is, how do we define ourselves? How do we actually link ourselves? We are this, we are that, by religion, by national origin, by region, by belief system. And therefore, we create the grounds for interdependence. If I'm a Jew and someone else is a Muslim, then we have to talk about interdependence because we've already declared ourselves to be different. And that difference is very dear to us. The paradox in that difference is that wanting to be different is not a bad thing. Because one way to create interdependence is to create uniformity. And that uniformity is easy to come by. You can try it from above, which was an experiment both in the Soviet Union and in earlier iterations in China, and in fascism. That's a possibility. And the other, of course, is voluntary uniformity, which is what we are engaged in as consumers. So there's a kind of commercial interdependence which is very easy to come by. The products, the habits, the diet, the pop music, the pop literature, the pop entertainment. There's a kind of nascent internationalism where everything really is much the same in a kind of a terrifyingly not totally encouraging way. So we can create solidarity and uniformity in a kind of mass sameness and mass recognition. That's not what I think we're talking about here. It's not what we wish. So how do we actually create, in the arts in particular, what is ultimately has to be local, something that we identify in a manageable scale of our community, whether we call it a nation, we call it a region, call it a conviction. How do we create difference, either as individuals or in small groups, and really develop lifelong loyalties to those distinctions, and at the same time become interdependent in a benign and constructive way? The truth is that the allegiances we have are often absolute, religious ones, which don't permit of tolerance. If I believe something to be true, I think something to be a crime that another person thinks is harmless, abortion, for example, in the United States, those differences are not easily bridged by live and let live. In the interdependence is some lurking argument of universalism, that we ought to share some moral truths, human rights, however we put them forward. And we think, well, those are right. There's some things that we won't tolerate. We believe, for example, those of us opposed to the death penalty in the United States consider it a universal claim that no government should have the right to take the life as a matter of law, no matter how heinous the crime. Those kinds of principled beliefs often are not often open to negotiation. One of the problems of really hard-felt local beliefs can be seen in Europe today, where the European Union is threatened by disintegration, not by the financial crisis that has engulfed it, not by the misdeeds of financing and governments, failures of certain governments to collect taxes and so forth and so on. But the fact is that there's no constituency for Europe on the ground. There is a constituency for nationalism. There is a constituency for local pride. But what psychologically plausible instrument do we provide for being European? Where are the enthusiasts for Europeans, for being a European outside of Brussels and those with some self-interest in that notion? So even in a small scale, it's extremely hard to fashion the political and cultural ways in which we can reconcile the necessary localism, the necessary specificity, let alone a radical individuality. So these are complex and troublesome questions. The historical basis for it, with respect to the arts, is not encouraging. I don't wish to be pessimistic, but people always think the arts, particularly music, my own field, to be a universal art form, a kind of instrument of solidarity among human beings of difference, what used to be called brotherhood, pardon the gender-specific notion of that, but where human beings could align themselves. I have been extremely suspicious of this because my memory is long enough to know that that doesn't quite work, that the same music, the experience of music, is as useful in creating solidarity that is defined by hostility to the other. The same Beethoven Ninth Symphony is performed at the fall of the Berlin Wall and performed for Hitler's birthday and for the celebration of the initial victories of the invasion of Russia in 1941. The arts are not a panacea, not a common ground really that has any traction if we view it in an old way. And so I would like to suggest that if we're going to make serious progress in interdependence, there are two things we have to try to figure out. One is, how do we rethink the local part? How can we turn nationalism into a positive virtue? It's not going to go away. How can we turn regionalism? The differences in our language. We actually want the dialects of the Swiss language, Swiss-German language, not to disappear, not to be washed away into a kind of TV-speak German. We would like the small pockets of Romansh that still exist in that nation to survive the ravages of centralization of media and communication. We cherish and want to preserve, the way we do endangered species, the absolute magical diversity of human experience and human expression in language. The story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis is not a punishment of God to have broken up our languages into one. It permitted us the flourishing of our own imaginations and diversity into individuality, to create strangeness as a positive thing. Why does being different require the hostility and destructiveness of the person who isn't like you? Why is it that when I look myself in a mirror and see the varying multiple ways I can conceive of myself as being related to the people most closest to me, whether it's a member of a family or a tribe or a religion or a neighborhood or a nation, and why does that then logically say that I have to dislike or be hostile to the person who doesn't resemble me? Why do I have to define the criteria of resemblance so narrowly? So we have to work on the basis of interdependence by rethinking our allegiances without a mythical universalism that is empty and has no psychological traction. Just being a human being, a global citizen, won't hold any more than being a European will hold. The scale is too large. The anonymity is too terrifying. Because at the core is some individual existence that seems distinctive, that is adequate existentially to the biological fact that each of us, in some sense, is unique. By the same token, uniformity may not be the only solution we can to the recognition that we live in a shared space that is not expanding. that the environmental impetus to interdependence, which seems so utterly logical and compelling. So on the one hand, we have to rethink the local, and the arts do a great deal in that regard, that the way we define, the specific way we express in our imagination, the aesthetic potential of our being, that it may be a way to find, not in sameness but in difference, a reason to foster interdependence and exchange. The same is to look at the existential basis through arts of the problems that make cooperation and interdependence hard. Poverty and inequality. To view the solutions to that not in the hostility to difference or exceptionalism. I'm concerned, as many other people are, not only from tyranny from above, the tyrannies of Gaddafi's or the tyrannies of single dictators, of Pol Pot's, but the tyranny from below, the comfort that many of our fellow human beings get from the resentment against that which is different, against dissent, against expression that is not comprehensible, that to what they might accuse of as elitism or exceptionalism. How do we actually retain difference and push back on the resistance to that as somehow taking away from ourselves if someone is different or even possibly better? How do we avoid a uniformity of measurement? Someone said about the harpist we just heard just before this event that he's the best harpist in the world. And my response was, but there's no such thing. Because art is not an Olympic sport. There is no best. And how do we stop thinking in terms which create invidious comparisons and therefore conflict? The two things I want to close with are that if the arts have any purpose in this, they are the creation of a non-linguistic empathy. The recognition of the human in the most remote circumstances. Some way of not bridging differences, but creating respect for differences. It's not clear that I can really quite understand in a way that is plausible or adequate a musical vocabulary that's completely different from my own, that I have grown up with since childhood, where I have a neurological predisposition to it from habit. But I can appreciate and understand that the difference is something glorious, even though I will never grasp it. I'll never get under its skin. I might not even ever enjoy it. But my respect for it is based on an empathy of what it must be like to function in that system, the way one would in a language one doesn't understand. So empathy is something the arts can do which exceeds the empathy that language creates. The problem we face in trying to forge an interdependence is that language is a weak instrument. The Nobel Prize winner Elias Canetti once said that the cruelest of illusions is that language communicates. And that is a very powerful, glib, however, insight. There is a limit to language. And the arts pick up where language ends in some way that we don't fully grasp. And insofar as that we are active in that, we come to respect not ourselves but others who are radically different in their capacity to express themselves beyond the limits of language. The fighting the failure of language leads to the second and most important thing the arts do, which is that they are elusive and can be lasting. So they fight against the erosion of memory. We've just been through a day of memorials about September 11th. And as you know, well, there wasn't a lot of remembering going on. There was there was a lot of creation of memory. There was documentation, but the important part of the memory is the way we construe memory. And in the construction of memory, we do a lot of forgetting as a matter of survival. The interesting thing about the arts is that they remember where we wish to forget. They are, in some sense, an extension of memory in a constructive way. We recognize the humility of our own existence as important. So if one hears even a pop piece, like the 1812 overture of Tchaikovsky, one remembers, well, there was once a person who wanted to conquer the world, and he lost, and a lot of people died, and it was a different war for which we have no direct emotional connection. We see paintings of worlds which we don't have any residue of, only the individual emotional portrait of a scene or an individual. It's a different kind of memory than is in a book. It's out there in architecture, it's out there in paintings, it's out there in sounds. It comes from our concert stages. It's about history and the obligation to continue human history. And while the threat to us is no longer a nuclear threat of the 60s in a bilateral world, there is a real possibility that in the interdependence through commercialism, through economics and technology, we will create an interdependence that's entirely hollow, that's made out of uniformity and the suppression of individuality and difference. And that would be a tragedy. And the arts are a form of resistance to that and a celebration that the ultimate interdependence is that among and between individuals. So I applaud the effort. I applaud the movement, Ben and all his colleagues. I admire the willingness to go against the current of historical example and to succeed where previous efforts have failed. Thank you.